the World Affairs Council Upstate America and the World online lecture series. We really appreciate you joining us today, and I'd like to take a minute just to let you know a little bit about who we are. The World Affairs Council Upstate is part of a national system of organizations. There are one in every state, at least one, and we're all dedicated to engaging our communities in global impact issues, foreign policy, and current events. Today we are so fortunate that we can bring to you a speaker who is nationally and internationally recognized on leadership. General John Allen, who is currently president of the Brookings Institute, will talk about leadership in these turbulent times. And we are in turbulent times. I read a quote the other day that said, "A leader is one who knows the way, who goes the way, and most importantly, who shows the way." I think our special speaker is definitely one of those leaders, and we're so lucky to have him. If you enjoy today's event, I would ask that you consider becoming a part of this organization. As a 501c3, we are dedicated to bringing these issues to you in the most non-political, nonpartisan, realistic, and academically based manner that we can. And it takes your support for us to keep doing that. So please take a look at upstateinternational.org for more information, or feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to speak with you. Today, to introduce our speaker and our moderator is the chairman of our World Affairs Council Upstate Steering Board, Mr. Rob Rowan. Rob?
Wow, this is a special event for us, and I appreciate everybody coming to hear our speaker and learn about leadership in these turbulent times. Besides being the president of the Brookings Institute, John has a little bit of a history of being involved in the military. To give you a little background, he's a retired four-star Marine general, and we've got somebody coming in, and he served 2 senior diplomatic roles since his retirement, which for the first 15 months as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East Palestinian peace process and security issues, and then he also was involved with working with counter-ISIL efforts for 15 months. He has been very busy with all that. During his 4-decade military career, he served in a variety of command and staff positions in the Marine Corps and Joint Forces, and he commanded 150,000 U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan from July 2011 to February 2013. He's the first Marine to command a theater of war. There's so much I could tell you about. There's so many areas where he has shown his leadership, but I want to share that I met John when he was a deputy commander at CENTCOM, and then he was the acting commander of CENTCOM. At that time, we talked leadership. We talked about Antietam and the American Civil War, and interesting enough, he taught that at the Naval Academy, where he was a commandant, as also had been an instructor. And I have met some of his students over the years who said his classes were great, and he was just somebody everyone felt a real deep appreciation for. And I think he was probably one of the best commandants they've had. So, of course, I want to do a little shout out to his superior officer, Kathy Allen, who has been with him all through his career and has been an amazing person. I'm sure John will say he could not have done it without her. And I will say that she's one of those great people. So, John, I thank you for giving us this time to talk about leadership. And to talk with John, to be the moderator, we have Dr. Shanice Chris, who you might remember did one with us early on the pandemic issues in the state. She's an assistant professor of health science at Furman University and a community engaged qualitative researcher addressing health equity and health communication. So her background is a doctorate from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She has a Master of Public Administration and a Presidential Public Service Fellowship from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She also has a Master of Public Health from Emory and an undergraduate degree from Oglethorpe in communication. As a public health practitioner, she served as a producer and host for a national television show for the Ministry of Health in Guyana, South America. And also, that was during her Peace Corps service. She has a lot of background in health, but today she's talking about leadership. And Dr. Chris, thank you again for coming. And at this point, I thank everybody for joining us and consider supporting us for future events.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. General Allen, we are all excited to hear from you. I would like to start with, what are some leadership lessons that you've learned over your career?
Well, Doctor, thank you very much for moderating this discussion. Thank you for your contributions to this moment of urgency in our country and this emergency that we're suffering. But also thank you for your service in the Peace Corps. What a great organization that is. And we see Peace Corps veterans achieving so much success. And I hope everyone will think about the Peace Corps as an opportunity. And Rob, it's great to see you after so many years. As I said, you look great. And Tracy, thank you for the invitation to join the World Affairs Council. Leadership is, I think we see every single day now in the crisis that we're experiencing, not just in the United States, but around the world, that so much of the solution to these crises is about leadership. And I think one of the points that I would make is that it's the point from which leadership has to emerge. And some of the characteristics that I have felt, I felt the strongest about were leaders who were, I'll just use the term, humble servants. Individuals who came from a position of selflessness, who came from a position that they must lead in a humble and selfless way, and that they serve a larger mission than themselves, that they serve those within the command. And leaders who are humble servants, leaders who, very importantly, wear their courage on their shoulders and can carry an organization through the day-to-day challenges that it faces, but also carry an organization through crisis by wearing their courage visibly, by being civil in all things, by respecting those that are junior to them as they are leading from a position of humility and a commitment to service. Those are the greatest leaders that I've experienced. Those who are arrogant or those who believe that it's about them, those individuals typically inhibit the kind of experience that we want an organization to be able to display in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. But the humble servant who wears her courage or his courage on their shoulders, who comes from a position of civility and respects everyone, that individual is able to work through the day-to-day challenges, but that individual is also up to the emergency of a moment as well, and can carry an organization through that emergency far more effectively than almost anyone else.
Thank you, that was beautiful. I want to talk about leadership in the global order right now. So are we seeing a shift in the global power and appeal of authoritarianism during this pandemic?
Sure. I think we are. Let me make a first comment, and that is that the United States has traditionally been able to bring really two things to every challenge around the globe. And the first is global leadership, the capacity to convene many of the states in the world, not all of them, not all of them will come when the president calls for them. Traditionally solved many of the crises in the world because America was ready to lead. And we led from a position of moral strength. We led from a position of commitment to values. And that commitment to values attracted other states like ours who were also committed to human rights and values and the rights of women and minorities and freedom of speech, all those things. And it was the strength of America's global leadership that was able to create the United Nations and many of the international organizations that have for so many years maintained the peace. But I said the United States had two things. One was the global leadership that we could exert when times were difficult and emergencies were pressing. But the other great attribute the United States brought was global reach. And I'm not talking about the global reach associated with military reach. That's self-evident, and it has been self-evident. I'm talking about the global reach of the attractiveness of who we are as a people. the global reach of the idea of America, the global reach of our economy. Still to this day, one of the most powerful forces on the face of the earth is the power of the American economy. And when it's used for good, everyone can benefit from that. So when the United States has been at its best, we were willing to lead globally, and we were willing to reach across the globe to try to create communities of states and communities of organizations that could come together to solve our biggest difficulties. As I was growing up in the Cold War, and as we emerged from the Cold War, I think that many of us believed that we were facing an arc of history that would someday deliver us into a world that was largely a world of democracies. But I think that's not the case now. And we need to be very, very careful. We have seen in the last decade or more a recession in democracy in many ways. Democratic principles, democratic values, systems of government. And we have seen a number of states that would have been traditionally called democracies. We have seen many of those in distress. We have a great scholar at Brookings, and this is not a plug for a book, but he wrote a great book called The Jungle Grows Back. And it's the point that in the aftermath of the Cold War, when we all thought we were headed for a world of democratic principles and democracies, that in fact has not happened. And where we have seen the emergence of illiberal leaders, where we have seen the strengthening of authoritarian governments, we have seen in some cases democracies rolled back. Places like Turkey, places like Hungary, places like the Philippines. And many of those countries had real challenges in being true democracies as we might have imagined them. But in many respects, those states have in fact democracy has receded in some of those states. And this, I think, has been accelerated actually by the pandemic. As we have seen states stricken by the pandemic, we have seen populist or illiberal leaders who don't value the principles of democracy as we do. They've taken this as an opportunity to seize power, to roll back democratic principles, to arrest activists who oppose them in their illiberal schemes. We have seen these individuals, and this is a very important point. When you see in what we have traditionally called a democracy, when you see leaders who are beginning to seize power talk about postponing elections, be very, very careful, because you have the democracy, you have democratic institutions that support the principles of democracy, and then you have democratic processes that permit us to sustain democracies. And when there is a blow struck against the democratic processes, and you hear leaders talking about postponing democratic elections and saying it's about COVID. We can't have an election because it's about COVID. We can't have an election because we can't use alternative means like mail-in ballots, et cetera. And I don't want to get political here, but we need to be very careful now. And so at Brookings, we talk a lot now about the community of democracies. And we need to think about this. Sometimes we use the term the West. And the West is a good term because it tends to translate to the transatlantic relationship, the relationship of Europe with North America, read Canada and the United States. But the democracies around the world are far more than just the West. And when we think about the great democracy of India, which is experiencing its own difficulties now, but the democracy of South Korea, the democracy of Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, we need to be thinking now about the very close relationship that we should be creating, the United States with its global leadership and our global reach, to begin to pull together the community of democracies in a global way. First, to strengthen our right, strengthen the values of why we stand for what we do as democratic societies, strengthen our commitment to humanitarian rights, the rights of women and democratic principles. But now we need to be thinking about how we come together as a community to solve this crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, lethal pandemic. And so this is our moment. This is the moment to recognize that illiberals will take an opportunity to take advantage of this open ground that has been created for them in this moment of crisis for the community of democracies to come together, to realize what we share together with great capitalist societies, technologically advanced, committed to human rights, and begin to think about how we can share on a global basis the solution to this crisis. Sorry to go on so long.
Oh, that was great. So along those lines, how can leaders best cooperate to address this crisis?
Well, first we have to talk to each other. You know, in the context of the American democracy, you know, the whole idea of America is that the 50 states surrender a certain amount of their autonomy to the central government in moments like this, in crisis. And so there's an expectation of national leadership, an expectation of a national strategy to deal with the idea of a vaccine, to deal with the idea of therapeutics, to distribute resources amongst the states so that those states hit the hardest are the ones that are in the highest priority for the kinds of resources that are necessary, like PPE and other equipment that might be necessary, that can work with the governors to assist them as they need assistance for material support or monetary support, et cetera. And the absence of national leadership or a national plan makes that very difficult. And when the governors have to fend for themselves, or when mayors have to fend for themselves, we see a general breakdown in the coherence that we as a great nation truly can bring to this problem. But it's like that, frankly, around the world. And the absence of American leadership and American leadership, talking and seeking to create a global coalition to deal with COVID-19, the absence of the United States in first creating that coalition and then leading that coalition means it will take much longer for us to solve this. Now, I watched President Obama in action when it's a different issue, but when the Islamic State exploded out of Syria in 2014, I watched him call for a global coalition to deal with this matter, because it wasn't just about Syria and Iraq. It was going to get bigger and it was going to get much worse. And the world's states came because America called. And the coalition that emerged from that had an economic dimension to it, a military dimension to it, an informational dimension to it, and a global commitment to solve not just the issue of the Islamic State, but to solve the underlying human causal factors that could create something like that. This is exactly the moment for the same kind of global leadership, to bring together the community of nations and the community of democracies to solve the component factors of what contribute to COVID-19, what can solve COVID-19, and very importantly, how can we put ourselves as a community on the road to recovery in ways that create institutions in the aftermath that can be enduring over the 21st century with other challenges, but very importantly, institutions that will resolve the long-term effects of inequality in our societies. This is our chance, and I think we're missing it.
It's interesting you say that, because we've all seen on the news recently that the United States is going to leave the World Health Organization. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about how can the United States have a leadership role if we're not taking it with the WHO?
Well, first of all, we're not demonstrating a global leadership role. That's the first problem. Look, we're part of the authors of the World Health Organization. And one of the reasons that the World Health Organization exists at all is to do just what we need for it to do right now. And that is pandemic surveillance, to try to coordinate globally the production of a vaccine, to work on the creation of therapeutics, to try to help states that are less fortunate than our own or less wealthy than our own, to embrace certain kinds of testing regimes, et cetera. And look, there will be plenty of time for us to do the retrospective about how the World Health Organization was either on time or late, or potentially mischaracterized the initial Wuhan virus as it emerged last year, COVID-19. There'll be plenty of time to do the postmortem on that. But when we pull ourselves out of the global health organization that has as one of its mandates to try to coordinate a global effort against a pandemic, we're just undercutting the potential for this global response that we need. This is an opportunity for the United States to double down on the World Health Organization, to empower it, to become a powerful ally of it, and to have the World Health Organization to become an ally of the American leadership coalition that we would put together conceivably to begin to solve these really daunting problems associated with COVID-19.
So, which nations will come through this pandemic with more influence on the global stage?
It's a very good question, and I don't know that we have an answer for it yet because I don't know how long we're going to be doing this. There are some who say that the Chinese will have greater influence. I don't know that that's the case. I think more and more as we continue this conversation about this community of democracies, and I'm constantly involved in conversations in the transatlantic world, the so-called West, where we are doing all that we can to commit ourselves, not just to solve COVID, but doing what we can to anticipate challenges in the future. So I think that if we do this right, and it's not entirely clear to me that we will do this right, but if we do this right, if we can see our way clear to share our values with other countries around the world in the idea of aggregating our resources, aggregating our innovation, aggregating our technology, and setting ourselves to the purpose of solving COVID, we could find that we will end up in exactly the place we want to be, which is a strengthened community of nations rather than a fragmented, incoherent community of nations. And right now, I think the jury is out on where we'll end up on this. The Chinese, I wrote something very early along about we are missing the opportunity to work with the Chinese to deal with this. Now, look, there's going to be lots of opportunity later to point fingers. And in fact, it started there, and probably the Chinese they were not forthcoming, and they were not transparent in the way they needed to be for us to move quickly enough, early enough, if we could have moved quickly enough and early enough. I don't think that the appeal of China and the appeal of the Chinese is going to reap for them in this moment such great advantages as to place them in a dramatically different position of power on the global stage. You hear about mask diplomacy. And, we have scholars all around the world from Brookings, and I talk to the scholars all the time. And it was not uncommon for a Chinese aircraft to land in a capital of a European state or East Asian state, and out would come tons of PPE and ventilators and therapeutics and doctors, Chinese doctors, to try to help these countries deal with COVID. And I think they were appreciated. I don't want to diminish that act was a useful humanitarian act, but almost without exception, every one of those individuals who made that observation to me said, we still rely on the United States over the long term to help us to solve this. Where are you guys? And so there's this great thirst in the world. There's this great desire in the world for the United States to demonstrate this tradition of global leadership. And so I think the jury is still out on this, Doctor. But if we do this right, if we think about this correctly, the good guys, will have achieved the position that we want to coming out of this as opposed to the illiberal or the authoritarian states.
Well, now I'm interested to hear about, do you think the economic and technological shifts that have been reshaping the post-World War II international order, do you think it will be accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think so. And we need to anticipate this. And that's another thing we're looking at a lot. The fact that I'm not sitting within 5 feet of you right now is a reality of the world that we live in. And we have driven much of the world onto the internet. And we've driven much of the world into a digital environment. And so I frankly am amazed at how quickly the US society pivoted from, if you will, an in-person environment to a virtual environment. And when you think about how quickly we did that, it is really remarkable. Thank God, frankly, we were not attacked. Our cyber capabilities were not attacked, and large segments of our internet not taken down. It would have been hugely disruptive at a moment of national crisis. And we've been able, by and large, to keep the process going. So yes, I think we now find ourselves in a digital environment which will place greater emphasis and greater desire for us to continue to operate in many ways in this environment. And so here is, I think, another advantage for the United States. And yes, the Chinese enjoy a coherence between the party and the state-run enterprises and what would be called the private sector that is much closer and creates a greater unity of effort with far greater resources in terms of innovation and application than perhaps the United States as a single entity. Our investment in technology as a government leaves much to be desired. We have to do much better over time. But here's the difference, and that is that the private sector within the United States, organizations like Apple and organizations like Microsoft and Google and Facebook, all these organizations, and yes, you can have a political difference with them, but the enormity of their influence and their capacity as entities to continue to dominate the digital environment, and I think to project values in many respects that may be absent in authoritarian states that are using the digital environment to increase surveillance on their population. And frankly, some of these states are using the digital environment as a means to intrude deeply into our democracies. And so there will be, I think, both an acceleration of innovation in the context of use of artificial intelligence and big data analytics and supercomputing to help us with pharmacology in terms of therapeutics and vaccines. I think we will see greater use of cyber defense as we go forward, because once again, we're so much on the internet, we're in such a virtual environment that we are really very vulnerable in many respects. So I believe that the entire digital environment is dramatically changed in the last 6 months, and I think it's going to be this way and moving faster over time, especially as we move into the 5G and the 6G environment.
I think all of us obviously have been thinking about COVID-19, but there are still so many other issues going on around the world. So what specific global hotspots deserve attention right now that may be overshadowed by the collective focus on global health and COVID-19?
Sure. And in some respects, some of these hotspots are accelerated in their deterioration, actually. A number of things. The Syrian civil war still burns brightly. It is a humanitarian disaster. The Libyan crisis continues to be a hotspot where we see a proxy war that has developed there in a very real way. Yemen is a humanitarian catastrophe, and that still is a major problem. Moving out of the Middle East, Afghanistan is still a challenge for us. The Taliban did not honor their peace agreement with us, and in fact, we're hearing the reporting that the Russians have been paying the Taliban bounties for the killing of American troops. At the very moment that we're potentially withdrawing from Afghanistan as in honoring our part of the peace agreement when the Taliban clearly haven't honored theirs. In East Asia, we have seen a massive deterioration in democracy in Hong Kong, the one country, two systems process. I really fear for the future of that. So we need to watch that. And I'm always attentive to North Korea and the potential challenges associated with the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, climate. Climate is still coming at us like a freight train. And frankly, here is another opportunity for the community of democracies to seize this as a moment as we begin the process of long-term recovery. And I mentioned the term, the very important term, equality. As we begin the process of recovery and we begin to tackle climate justice, as we begin to tackle the effects of climate in a very real way on vulnerable populations in the United States, but around the world, here is an opportunity for us to try to redress some of what I think is the accumulating effects of climate on vulnerable communities and fragile nations around the world. And then finally, there are many fragile states, whether it's in Southeast Asia, or it's in South Asia, or it's in Africa, or in South Africa. There are many fragile states that on their very best day before COVID were not wealthy, lacked depth in their capacity to govern, were unable to provide services to large segments of the community, or suffered from frankly, massive corruption. And COVID has made the fragility of those states even greater. And so again, a global coalition led by the United States ought to be thinking about which of those states are the most fragile right now. And as we go to solve the issue of the disease, be thinking about what we can be doing to bolster these states to keep them from collapsing entirely, as their health systems, in fact, will collapse if COVID really takes off inside those countries. So there are many challenges right now, and hotspots will come in lots of different forms and in many different geographical areas.
How do you think we can get the coalition to think about all these issues and balance it? Because people have their priorities and what's right in front, but everything that you mentioned is very important. So what would be our strategy for people to think about their country and others?
Yeah, well, your question is extraordinarily important because so many states have turned inward. They've had to take care of themselves, and who can blame them for that? But there hasn't been a global call for that coalition that permits states, while they're still turning inward and solving COVID, in many respects, many states have in fact come a long way to both flattening and lowering the curve, and they're way ahead of us. Almost everyone is way ahead of us, except for Brazil and some of the other states that are just down the list a bit. So in the absence of this global call for a coalition, as I said, to do several things, to get after the vaccine, to get after the therapeutics, to share treatment lessons learned, to share resources across national boundaries, and to come together with a commitment both to deal with the disease and to deal, this is very important, to deal with the recovery issues, the long-term economic and bureaucratic and governmental recovery issues. Absent that, countries will still remain focused inward or be focused in their very isolated regional areas. This is, as I said, this is the opportunity for the United States and the community of democracies to step forward and begin to think not just about the disease, but to think about, and to begin to plan the long-term recovery.
I like that you're talking about long-term recovery, but there may be, again, another issue that comes forth. As with time, it always seems that happens. So how do we prepare for the next big one, whether it's a global event in climate, health, technology, security, or the cyber realm?
Well, we have to think broadly about what the challenges will be of the 21st century. For me, I'm often asked, what do you think the greatest threat to the United States is in the 21st century? And people will say, they'll expect me to say, it's China, or it's the Russians, or it's jihadist terrorist movements. I tell them the greatest threat to the United States is the greatest threat to the globe, and that's climate. And as we think about those challenges, we have to be able to think at the deep horizon. And the deep horizon, today we're thinking right here at the near horizon. We're trying to get through the end of the day by saving as many lives as possible and positioning ourselves through testing regimes, et cetera, to just start to flatten the curve. I mean, this is a day-to-day fight for us, and it's really a moment-to-moment slugfest. But we need to be thinking out 5 years in terms of the beginnings of the recovery, but we also, at the same time, to your point, Doctor, we need to be thinking at the deep horizon, a generation from now. What will the world look like a generation from now? And what will the challenges be for us, and how can we begin to posture our national and international capabilities to begin to think about this? Climate is going to change a lot. Climate is going to, just for example, I think Africa is potentially one of the greatest opportunities of the 21st century. By the middle of the century, a quarter of the world's population will live in Africa. But for now, many of those states are very fragile. in the context of their capacity both to govern and to deliver services and to provide some hope for the populations to achieve their personal aspirations. That is being complicated enormously by COVID right now. And we need to be thinking about this. And as the climate situation deteriorates, as temperatures rise, as arable land becomes uninhabitable, as agriculture begins to become compromised, we will suffer, undoubtedly, we will suffer enormous numbers of climate migration. You know, today we largely see conflict migration and economic migration as often the principal causes of people getting on their feet and going somewhere else. But once the climate begins to render the land unlivable, and large swaths of Africa, frankly, are susceptible to that in the next 50 years, we could see hundreds of millions of people begin to move globally because they simply can't live where they have traditionally. So for us, thinking out a generation, what the climate environment will look like in a generation, and we know where that will affect populations, help them now through bioengineering, et cetera, to begin to master agricultural systems based on crops that are enduring, can endure great heat, can endure less water. Begin to think about that now to anticipate the problems. And then one final thing, you know, as temperatures rise, we're going to see tropical diseases begin to migrate as well. We're already beginning to see it. And, you know, here we've had a pandemic that wasn't a tropical disease, but it was a disease that originated in the food chain. And we need to be thinking about, as we have in the United States in our case, and many of the countries in the community of democracies, we have pretty sophisticated intelligence systems and pretty sophisticated technological capacity to surveil the global environment. And we ought to be thinking about how we can create the kind of global surveillance capability for both pandemics and some of these negative trends that can help us to not just anticipate them, but to begin to marshal resources to try to ameliorate them as they become more apparent.
It seems when you think about climate change, depending on the country, that politics and economics is a big decision or reason why some people may not take a step forward with things that could help with climate change. So what can we do about that?
Well, we're doing a lot of work on that also at Brookings. And one of the greatest casualties of climate change is going to be the economies. You know, the global GDP, there isn't enough power in the global GDP to frankly begin to anticipate coping with the climate change that we'll see over the next 50 years. And so if there was ever a reason, I'm not talking about just the temperature going up. I think we're going to pass 2 degrees centigrade no matter what, Celsius no matter what. I think we're just going to see that. We've been hoping to keep it at 1.5. I think we're going to blow right past it. And that's going to, and there you'll see much of that part of the world in that swath become very difficult to live in agriculturally. So if we can't appeal to someone's desire to deal with climate because they're not going to have to worry about sea level rise, or they're not going to have to worry about the temperature getting too hot. If we can't appeal to them on that ground, we can certainly appeal to them as we begin to do the analysis that will show the economic toll that the global GDP will suffer as a direct result of climate change. So there are people that say, look, you know, I need to continue a coal-fired energy generation system. That is a losing strategy. It is a losing strategy. It actually contributes to the deterioration of the economy. It doesn't hold it. And so the short-term, short-sighted orientation on economics, as opposed to embracing systems of economics and technologies that can deliver us into a green environment. And I'm not talking, you know, a measured approach to a green environment. If we're not embracing, in an economic sense, the kinds of technologies and resources necessary to begin to generate clean energy and to decarbonize, then the economies are going to take care of themselves. We will be bankrupt. It's not possible for us to move into the latter half of this century and not have our economies in a shambles if we're not thinking about it now.
Thank you. So at this point, I would like to invite our participants to write questions in the chat box. There are some questions there already, so I'm going to take a moment and read some questions to you and get
Sure.
your feedback. Thank you. So, and it's a variety of issues because your talk has had people thinking about a lot of different things. So one person said, I'm concerned, let's see. Oh, they were talking about elections. Okay. There have been talk about the president refusing to accept results of the election in November. The charge would be that there would be election fraud. If that happens, what do you think would be the response by Congress and, more important, our military?
I'll start with the military. The military, perhaps uniquely in the United States, since our birth as a nation, has always been subordinate to civilian control, and it has to be that way. It will always have to be that way. But from the very moment I was commissioned, one of the things that I learned was I had a moral obligation to disobey an illegal order. And we've been trained that way forever. That's why the military is always on the right side of the law. And so we would obviously, the military would still operate within the law. We would still operate under civilian control. So I think that's the first thing I would say. And the second, I think that I'm not going to surprise anyone by saying that there are probably people that are thinking right now about the various scenarios and outcomes that might occur in the election in November. And remember, we're a government of three unique components: the legislature, the executive, and of course the judiciary. And this judiciary will end up, in many respects, being the point of first resort in the event that there is a contestation of the election. And we've seen that before. I mean, we saw that in the election in 2000. So I think that there may well be a challenge to the outcome of the election. But my guess would be that it would pretty quickly end up in the courts, where at that point the decision of the Supreme Court would ultimately decide the election.
Now, this is a question dealing with COVID-19. If the federal government continues to not take a stance on this global response, there are states, they said, for example, New York, that could represent the leadership at the international level. Is that possible, that a state can represent on the international level and not the country?
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's something called Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations developed a few years ago, which are largely the goals that were committed to by the membership of the United Nations, which in the end creates the humanitarian outcome that we all desire in terms of clean water and frankly, pandemics and human rights and the rights of women, many different, there's 17 of them. And interestingly enough, under this administration, the United States has largely dismissed the Sustainable Development Goals. But many of our states unilaterally are participating with the United Nations in being committed to climate and committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're reporting individually to the United Nations. So I see, of course, I'm not in the government now, so this is just simply a personal opinion. I would be very surprised if governors and mayors are not having conversations with international counterparts about what lessons learned, what are the best lessons learned, and how perhaps they can share across national boundaries. My guess would also be that the U.S. federal government would not prohibit that from happening, but wouldn't facilitate it necessarily. And so, from my perspective would be for a governor or for a mayor, have at it, go for it. If you're not getting what you need to out of Washington, you're not a traitorous leader if you look across the water or you look across a national boundary and seek assistance in this crisis.
I really appreciate that advice. I'm on a city council in the area, and so we're definitely dealing with a lot of these issues and ordinances. And so we're all trying to get information from every source to make good decisions. So another person asked, on a national level with COVID-19, what would you recommend to ideally balance the advantages of a national, centralized response, such as the cohesiveness of a message, with the advantages of state and local response, such as the ability to tailor policies to the local circumstances?
Well, it's a great question. You know, the first thing is tell the truth. Yeah, one of the problems we have right now isn't that people of goodwill, frankly, aren't trying to lean forward and solve this problem. The problem is we have so many different opinions that appear to project themselves as authoritative, mostly at the national level, that you know, the American public is really whipsawed back and forth by half-truths, frankly, lies, and misinformation. And we've heard Dr. Fauci over the last few days and other health, and you are one of them. They've said, look, you've got to listen to the people that know. And to the question, and it was a great question by the person that submitted it, if we just had a coherent national, state, municipal, and local narrative, a coherent narrative of what this disease is and what it isn't, how we should, as a nation, as a state, as a city, take those steps necessary to flatten the curve, what steps are necessary in coordination with the CDC, supported by our political leadership in dealing with these matters. If we just had that alone, then we would all be operating in a far more coherent, efficient, and effective way. But the absence of a coherent national narrative, where in fact the reaction to COVID has now become grotesquely politicized. And so on the one hand, we have governors who are desperately attempting to come to grips with hotspots in their states being undermined by messaging from Washington. And just the coherent narrative alone. And then a national strategy that would have multiple components to it, which would be the emphasis on vaccines, the emphasis on therapeutics, you've heard me say that before, on technology and machinery, PPE, all of those kinds of things. Having a strategy, a multifaceted strategy that attempts to work from the national through the state, through the municipal, through the local level, just having that coherent strategy, it's not going to solve the problem, but it certainly creates an opportunity for us to all move in the same direction. And we are not moving in the same direction. We're bumping into ourselves all the time now.
Well, it stood out to me of all of those things that you said, also the point of the cohesiveness in messaging. So for instance, yesterday, I saw the op-ed with the 4 directors of the CDC, past directors, and saying how it never was so politicized. So it's just very interesting time. So the next
this politicization will be paid for in lives. We should all be thinking in those terms. We're going to pay for this politicization in lives.
Wow. I think that should be the title of the next op-ed. So the next question is, do you have any understanding why we left the northern border Syria and left the Kurds at the mercy of Turkey?
Well, it's pretty clear. I didn't understand it. Look, I helped President Obama run the global coalition. And I remember very clearly the meeting that we had in Paris of the coalition members, where we anticipated that there would come the day that we would defeat the Islamic State and that we would ultimately begin to create an environment of stabilization for that population of Syria that had been liberated from just the incredibly odious environment and domination of the Islamic State. We knew that was going to happen. And what we needed to have happen was for that population, which was largely a Kurdish Syrian population, for that population plus the Arabs that lived there and the Turkoman and the Syriac and the other elements of the population, Christians that lived in that area, was to create a stable environment that could recover governance, recover human rights, recover the economic deterioration that had occurred under the Islamic State. But it required stabilization. And one of the most important dimensions of that stabilization wasn't just that members of the coalition would contribute money to that, and that was a very important contribution. The United States refused to. It was that we put about 2,000 special operators on the ground there to continue to work with Syrians, the what we call the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was largely a Kurdish element. And we intended to be there for however long it would take to stabilize the population, to make sure that we didn't have a backflash of the Islamic State, Daesh, it's called in that part of the world. And ultimately, over time, as the situation in Syria resolved itself, that portion of Syria that had been stabilized over a long period of time, overwatched by just 2,000 American soldiers, that portion of Syria would rejoin potentially a greater Syria as the civil war would end. None of us could see that in the short term. But a 2,000 person investment was a relatively small investment for what had happened. We had defeated the Islamic State there for all intents and purposes. And we had returned that population largely to pre-war existence. Now, so we all woke up in the morning after Erdogan and the president had a phone call, and Erdogan intended to attack the Kurds. I could take a long time to explain that whole Kurdish issue and the Turkish view on it. We don't have the time for that today, but we got about 24 hours notice for the 2,000 Americans to get out of town. And they had been there for a long time, and they had created deep relationships with the Kurds, and we'd shed our blood together with them. And I have to say there were coalition members in there as well, so our precious coalition and our allies were there. But when I saw two things, when I saw the Americans driving out in their armored vehicles, driving east to get out of the way of the Turkish attack on the population we had just helped to rescue from Daesh, a firepower intensive attack, and people were throwing rotten vegetables at the Americans for deserting them, I thought that was one of the most humiliating sights I had seen in a very long time. And so, again, we could talk about this. I could give you a very long explanation about it. It would make sense in the end, but that decision was made without consulting with the Pentagon. That decision was made without consulting with allies. And 24 hours, I said there were two things that contributed to our humiliation. Part of it was within 24 hours, there were Russians in our battle positions eating the food that the American soldiers didn't have time to pack because we had to leave so quickly. This was not a great moment for the United States. And the message is, you side with the United States, you might wake up one morning and you find that you're not on the United States side anymore. And that's a problem.
Wow. The next question is, can you speak to your view of the recent attempts to politicize the military and the evolving relationship between active duty personnel and their civilian leaders?
Well, once again, unique in the world in many respects. The United States military has always been, and in my long study of the history of the United States and the military, the United States military has always been under civilian control. There have been occasions, difficult occasions, when very senior military leaders have been removed by civilian leaders. And we saw that with Harry Truman, President Truman, and Douglas MacArthur. So there have been difficult moments in the civil-military relationship. So I think we should all recognize that those times come and go. And we've just gone through a difficult moment. But I think the important word that I've heard being spoken constantly as we sought some way to find an equilibrium in this moment was the term the Constitution. And so long, first of all, as a young officer, and I know we have former officers and former enlisted members who are watching this show, this presentation, one of the things as an officer that I swore the day I was commissioned was I would support and defend the Constitution of the United States. This goes back to the early lesson that I learned that you must obey lawful orders and never obey an unlawful order, because the Constitution is the body of law. It creates the body of law to which we are committing our very lives to protect. And so there will be times when there are difficulties in the civil-military relationship. But I think we have seen a very interesting adjustment recently where very senior American leaders in the Department of Defense and very senior uniformed leaders have been clear and very public in their commitment to the Constitution, in their commitment to the ideals of America, and are working very, very hard to try to keep the United States military from being politicized in this very difficult moment.
Thank you. The next question is, given that there will be so much work to be done in restabilizing a post-COVID-19 world, do you think a critical part of that rebuilding process will be for countries to include giving marginalized groups a seat at the table? And given this nation's own troubles, how can we still help facilitate that inclusion?
I don't think that still help facilitate is the term I would use. I would make that my #1 priority. If we're going to recover from this moment, this is our chance to deal with the issue of social injustice, inequity, and inequality, which has in many respects characterized the American democracy since day one. And in fact, it's much earlier than day one, because slavery and the oppression of the Black population in the United States is our original sin as a country. Here is our chance as we begin to walk down this long, difficult road to recovery, for us to be committed from the very beginning of this moment, to be committed to resolving inequality as an inherent characteristic of our strategies and roadmaps for recovery. And I would say, in essence, our strategy should be an investment strategy, and a strategy where we invest in our Black and brown communities, our vulnerable communities, so that as we come out of this, those communities are floated higher along with the rest of the American economy and other elements, traditional elements of the United States. But if we don't, as leaders in the country, and if our politicians don't openly commit themselves in the recovery process to redressing these generations of social injustice and seeking to do all we can to deal with matters of inequality for our vulnerable populations, then we will have missed an historic opportunity that is handed once in a century to a people like the United States, because we all want to do the right thing. We've just never seen it as clearly as we see it right now, and we've never been handed the opportunity in the context of recovery and reopening and rethinking who we are as a people and rethinking what bureaucracies and systems that we need to put in place for true recovery. We've never been handed the opportunity, A, to see the inequality on the one hand and to see the opportunity on the other. Now is the opportunity for us to seize that.
And I really do hope that we're able to seize this moment.
I do too. I really do.
The next question is, can you tell us what you think the impact will be of the Iran-China 25-year strategic cooperation agreement, which includes military, political, and economic components? How will that affect U.S. interests in our region, and how Washington maneuvers vis-a-vis both Iran and China?
Yeah, look, I'm just speculating now. I do have a lot of experience with Iran, and I've got a good bit of experience with China. We should not be surprised at all that the Chinese want a long-term relationship with Iran. We should not be surprised at that. And at the heart of that isn't an inherent Chinese love of the Iranians or an Iranian love of the Chinese. At the heart of it is an economic relationship based around energy. The Chinese economy is enormous, and that economy runs on energy, and having access to energy is one of the most important dimensions of Chinese foreign policy. So we shouldn't be surprised at it, but we also need to be very clear those kinds of relationships that we need to be clear to the Chinese, certainly, with whom we can still have a cooperative, constructive relationship if we don't screw this up too badly. And very clear with the Iranians on what we won't tolerate from them. We need to be very clear on what aspects of a Chinese-Iranian relationship we just simply won't tolerate. Iran has been two things. In the region, it has been one of the greatest destabilizing forces and facilitators of terrorism in the region. And frankly, people that we have called our partners and allies out there, they haven't been all that great either, frankly. But Iran unquestionably has been one of the great destabilizers of the region. But the other, I said there were two things. One is the destabilization of our Sunni Arab partners, but also Iran has, of course, pursued a nuclear weapons system. And we should never, ever permit the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. And it comes in three forms. It comes with a complete nuclear fuel cycle, uranium fuel cycle, or plutonium extraction capability. It comes with a ballistic missile capability. It has a weaponization capability. We need and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA that we signed up to and negotiated for years, prohibited that from happening, prescribed that. Now we're out of it, and it's beginning to deteriorate. So any relationship that the Chinese have with the Iranians that either exacerbates or accelerates their capability for regional instability, or as we might perceive it, helps them in the context of a nuclear capability, we need to be very clear from the outset that that's not something we will tolerate.
Thank you. The next question is, you briefly touched upon the role of private technological corporations in the context of America's COVID response. With the prevalence of many of these larger tech companies in our daily lives, is there any real accountability for the policy decisions of these private companies and their leaders?
That's a great question. And in many respects, we've seen that these companies are very different. And I don't want to get into naming particular companies, but I think several things that have become more observable. First, there's this term corporate social responsibility that we have heard more of in the last several years. And it's not just for corporate social responsibility, where corporations have a responsibility to give back to their societies and to make the people who are affected by those corporations make their lives better, and to give back to communities and give back to the country. So corporate social responsibility has become a greater and more important dimension of corporate performance. And I know a number of CEOs who in fact are judged in the end annually by their boards and by frankly the broad public, by their commitment to corporate social responsibility and their ability to deliver on it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think that COVID just by itself has created pressures on the large corporations, depending on what sector you're from. If you're in the tech sector, it hasn't been as bad for them as it has been, say, for the hospitality sector, the hotel industry, or the restaurant industry. And I think what we are seeing is, and frankly, very importantly, the Americans in the street, after the tragic death of George Floyd and the other Black Americans and others who've suffered so long in this environment, we have seen that voice raised to a level where our corporate entities in the United States can no longer feign deafness. They're listening to that. And I think it complements very well their commitment to corporate social responsibility. And so when you hear this deafening voice coming up from the streets on dealing with social injustice and increasing diversity and giving opportunity to Black and brown communities and vulnerable communities they've never seen before, and you see this commitment on the other hand to corporate leadership being oriented on social responsibility, here again is one of these moments that we should seek to leverage. And here's where our political leadership ought to be calling for that very thing, because it can't be all about the government. It just can't be. We're putting trillions of dollars into keeping our economy afloat and keeping food on the tables of thousands and actually millions, tens of millions of Americans who are out of work. The government and ultimately the taxpayers and our national debt simply can't be the single bill payer here. Now is the time for that element of the private sector who hasn't profited from this, but who've not been harmed by this as badly as other sectors, to step forward and be part of the solution.
From what you're saying, it also made me think about the role of social media and the role of regulation. You were also talking about misinformation. So what are your thoughts about social media and COVID-19, race issues that we have in the U.S.,
Sure.
and the role of regulation?
Yeah, I'm really worried about this. And in fact, social media is a super highway straight into the area between my ears. It gives people access to my thought processes and to my value system and to my capacity to both embrace and absorb news. And it's unique in the world. I mean, we've gone for thousands and thousands of years where the sovereign of a country, in the context of traditional ideas of sovereignty, controlled basically everything within the geographic boundaries of a particular country. The digitization of information and the proliferation of social media platforms has in many respects given really negative influences access to our minds that we could never have imagined just a few years ago. And so to some extent, this has been, for an open system and an open society and for our democracies, this has been an enormous vulnerability that has been exploited by the Russians. We know that from the 2016 election. They tried it again in 2018. They're trying it again right now. The Chinese are in the game. There's a lot of other people in the game. Internationally, in the United States, you see the white supremacist movement that is operating on social media. And in many respects, they are almost as great a national security threat in the context of stoking racial tension and just creating an inability to come together as a population. And the superhighway to make that happen has been the influence mechanisms of social media. So to your question, should we regulate social media? And the answer is, if we don't see the tech companies take the kinds of responsibility necessary to get lies off their platform, to get divisiveness off their platform, to get racial epithets and intentional efforts to divide us at a racial, ethnic, and religious level off their platforms, then the Congress will have to act. But the responsibility should first and foremost be with the private sector. And we have seen some elements within the private sector in terms of social media attempt to act responsibly in this matter. The question is it enough, fast enough, and how long can we tolerate it before we have to begin to regulate that? Now, the other side of that same coin is the moment you begin to regulate the content in social media, the question becomes, are we striking a blow against the First Amendment of the Constitution? It's a very delicate moment. It's a very delicate conversation, but we need to be eye deep in that conversation right now because we're still an open society. We're still very vulnerable. We're also quite delicate right now. This whole issue, the emergence of Americans in the street in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, that has created even greater delicacy, if you will. We're even more delicate than we were before. And so we need to be protecting our back, if you will, from those forces that want to use social media to divide us even more or to put us at each other's throats. We need to be even more careful and attentive to that than we were before.
I appreciate hearing that. I have a line of research where I use social media to measure race sentiment, and we can
Sure.
see, you can definitely see where it goes up and lower in action. And so it's just very interesting to see how social media works. So the last question I have here, so participants, if you have any other questions, this would be the time to put it in the chat box. So the last one that's here right now is, what is your position on nuclear power to help mitigate the climate crisis?
Okay, that's a complex answer. In the end, we should seek sources of energy that don't rely on nuclear power. And I think that's generally believed to be the right way to go. And that's where I think we ought to end up. The question, since nuclear by and large is very clean, the question is, if we don't have the alternative green sources of generation, but we're taking nuclear power offline early, are we in fact doing this in the measured way necessary to deal with the issues that are needed for climate? And I know that there are a number of countries with nuclear power that have begun to take them offline that haven't been able to develop the kind of clean sources of power generation that they would have wanted to, and they're regretting it actually. So my view would be, in the end, we should move away from nuclear power, but I think we should do that in a measured way that gives us the capacity to compensate for the loss in generation by the propagation of those kinds of clean resources and clean sources of energy, and do it in a compensatory way, being very careful not to give opportunity for increased carbon generation because we have to do more with fossil fuels in compensation for nuclear power coming offline. But I think in the end, nuclear power will ultimately go away.
Okay, they also had a follow-up question. Do you see future possibilities of using nuclear material from current nuclear states to reduce stockpiles while at the same time producing clean power?
That's probably beyond my level of expertise. I certainly would see that that's something we should consider, but I just don't have really an opinion on that.
Okay. Another question, what are your thoughts about General Mateus leaving and then leaving the administration, also Admiral Joe McGuire?
Who was the first name, please?
General Mateus or Mathis, I'm sorry, I mispronounced.
Oh, General Mattis.
Yes, Mattis, pardon me.
Well, Mattis left because he believed he could no longer serve his values were such that he could no longer serve within his values. And so he did the right thing. He tendered his resignation. And that's the point where I think anyone who serves in an administration will serve to the point where they don't, their values are not compromised. And once you're beginning to approach that level, you have to go. And he was very clear that he left because he believed that he could no longer, with a clear conscience and in the context of his values, continue to serve. Joe McGuire, I'm not as clear. I know him. He was a SEAL, as I recall. He's a great fellow. But he left DNI. He was acting director, I think, of the director of the National Security, the Office of National Intelligence, sorry, DNI. I think he left early. I don't recall whether he resigned or not.
Okay, thank you. I have a few more questions. So, someone wrote, why do you think conservatives are not following social distancing and wearing masks? Surveys show them much less likely to do so than liberals. How do you think you can get them to do so?
I can't answer that. All I would say is that responsible individuals ought to be doing social distancing and wearing masks. This is not a matter of your politics. It's not a matter of your faith, really. This is a matter of, I said before that leadership was about selflessness. Part of being selfless in this crisis is doing those things that we know are necessary ultimately to take care of our fellow woman and fellow man. And we know that these are necessary actions that we have to take, social distancing and wearing a mask. And so, I'm not going to answer whether conservatives do it or not, or liberals do it or not. I think that's a false distinction. It's those who are fully embracing, I think, those measures that must be taken at an individual level to be responsible within society, flatten the curve, and to protect everyone around them.
Thank you. The next question, someone said, you began this presentation with a description of leadership. What is a mechanism that can be used nationally to help voters judge candidates on these criteria, to get them away from tribal thinking and to select good leaders?
Well, leading by example is one way. Telling the truth is another way to judge a leader. Taking responsibility is another way to judge a leader. And so if you find yourself in a position where the choices are leaders that are frank and upfront and take responsibility and are willing to take a hard knock and admit to fault or admit to mistakes, as opposed to someone who never tells the truth or who avoids taking responsibility or who blames others, I think that choice gets pretty clear pretty quickly. So again, we're looking for leadership. We're looking for someone who's willing to lead and not simply willing to occupy a position of high office. And there's a difference between the two. And people get into office all the time who were popular and they look good and they said the right things at a particular moment. But I think we all believed in watching them that they didn't have the juice of character and integrity ultimately to lead from the front by being a humble servant of the people as opposed to a servant of their own ambitions. And pretty discernible.
Well, the next question leads directly to being humble. So this person says, in the beginning, you mentioned being humble as a characteristic of great leaders. Women, however, are expected to be humble and are largely ignored when they're humble. What effective characteristics have you seen in women leaders? How can women step up and be recognized as leaders in some of these important issues?
You know, I'm not sure that leadership is different from one to the other, but I would simply, one gender to the other, but I would simply say that that great leaders can be humble, but that also doesn't mean they're invisible. You know, great leaders who are visible in the positions that they take, great leaders who are accessible to those that they lead, great leaders who are willing to take responsibility. Those are positions that we want our leaders to take. And so whether it's about gender or not, I'm not so sure I'm qualified to make that particular pronouncement. But I was honored and deeply impressed over the years to serve with great leaders who were women and great leaders who were men. And some of the greatest qualities that I saw in both of them were what defined the leadership that I came to embrace myself as I watched them in action and they became my mentors. And some of the greatest mentors I had, frankly, as leaders when I was growing up in the Corps were women. And they were magnificent leaders. So I'm always very careful about attempting to make the distinction between a woman leader and a male leader. I would simply say that the characteristics of good leadership, when imbued in a particular person, will create both the aura and the reality of leadership.
Thank you. Another question is, what lessons can we, this person said, we older veterans teach our younger veterans to help them engage with civic engagement?
Well, service is really important. You know, not long ago, we have every year, we have a lot of the high school students from around Washington, D.C. come to Brookings, and we spend time with them. Some of them become interns, and we have a mentor-protege relationship amongst our staff at Brookings with the young students around Washington, D.C. And one of the points that we make for them, and it's not just about Brookings, but your question was older veterans for younger veterans. One of the points that we make to them constantly is seek as you grow, seek as you mature in life, seek opportunity for leadership, to be of service to your fellow woman or man. Seek to be of service. That's really important. And for those who have been in the service, for those who are what we would call older veterans, and I guess I would be an older veteran, we've had the chance to serve. We've had the chance to go through, in many respects, go through combat, go through wars. We've seen the human cost of being committed to the Constitution and the human cost of being committed to the principles of America. And in the end, it's all about the American people. That was the whole idea of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It was about the principles of a nation of the people, by and for the people. And so the older veterans lived that. They lived it in Iraq. They lived it in Afghanistan. They've lived it in World War II and in Vietnam and in Korea. They lived that. And so they can bring that commitment to higher principles, to being part of something bigger than themselves. They can make that point to the younger veterans, who, by the way, are learning it every single day themselves. And as we used to have a commandant years ago who said that the great value of the Marine Corps was we win battles and we make Marines. And his point was, it isn't about the battles often, it's about the person that we made and we call a Marine, because when they go back to their communities, they have the ability to give back to their societies. And it's not, frankly, it's not limited to Marines, because we have great soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Coast Guard individual guardsmen who are also doing the same thing. So the older veterans can speak to service, older veterans can speak to commitment, older veterans can speak to integrity and honor, and the younger veterans ought to be listening.
Thank you. I have 2 more questions, and then our time will be elapsed. So from this participant, with regard to Iran, could you see a scenario where we can coexist with a nuclear armed Iran do they not have the right as a sovereign nation to pursue a nuclear program?
Well, you asked, that's two different questions, two very different questions.
Okay.
It's not directed at you, Doctor. It's the question itself. There's a big difference between a nuclear-armed Iran and an Iran with a civil nuclear program. Big difference. And frankly, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, envisaged that Iran could have a limited civil nuclear program, but it did not permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And I don't see Iran. I don't see that we should ever permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now, we've had multiple Iranian leaders, probably the most vocal of them, but they've all been vocal about this, have been very clear that Israel is anathema to them. And we've had leaders talking about burning the Zionist entity from the map. And you don't burn a Zionist entity from the map except through nuclear capabilities. And so for no other reason than that we must prohibit, preclude, prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon because of our ally Israel. For no other reason than that, we should never permit the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. But even under a nuclear umbrella, even if they don't attack Iran with it, having a nuclear umbrella under which they can perform mischief, the likes of which we've not even seen to this day, given their terrorist destabilization of the Middle East, is intolerable from my perspective. So to the questioner, it was a really important question. There is a difference between having a nuclear weapon and having a civil nuclear program, which in fact, according to the IAEA and international treaty, is in fact something that they could have. But precluding them from having a civil nuclear program that gives them a breakout capability to have a nuclear weapon is what we should be preventing them from having.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question from our participant. Do you see any way to bring this country together that embraces Black Lives Matter and police feeling appreciated?
I think it's one of the most important questions we should be asking ourselves right now. I've been in several countries, in at least 2 wars, where the absence of police made life just miserable for the population, simply because of criminality. So there will always be, and we're sometimes hearing the debate as to whether we need police or whether we should defund police, et cetera. And I don't think that's the extreme end of that conversation isn't where we should be having the conversation. We should be talking about the construction of police departments that serve their communities. We should be talking about police departments that are funded to the level where they're involved in law enforcement, but not expected to do so many other things that have gravitated into the arms of police because other aspects of society couldn't perform those functions. But at the same time, the Black Lives Matter movement is essential. It is a figurehead movement that provides us the capacity to focus on that dimension of our society and create an environment where we can come together to have the conversation, not just about Black Lives Matter, but also what the police departments look like going forward. Because, again, society will hold together to an extent, but there is without police, but I don't think there is a rational argument that can be made that we can go forward as a nation without robust police forces that ultimately protect us in a law enforcement standpoint. The question isn't whether we need that or not. The question is whether the police as it exists today is oriented against the population or for the population. And so many police are out there every single day risking their lives for you and me, and they deserve our thanks. But there are elements of those forces that we need to think very hard about, whether there are individuals on the force that should be in the force, that should ever have been inducted. Are we training them properly? Are we working as a police force with civil society and the Black Lives Matter movements, for example? Are we in consultation with political leadership so that we have the complete 360 environment within which police can operate? That way the police have the support of civil society. Police have the support of Black Lives Matter. Police have the support of the elected representatives. And they don't exist as a separate entity doing their own thing. And I think this is the opportunity for us to have that conversation.
Thank you so much for your discussion today. It has been a privilege. Thank you for your authentic, powerful comments. And I know that we all got a lot from it today.
Thank you, Doctor.
So much.
It's an honor to be with you, ma'am.
Oh, thank you. And so now I'll just do the concluding remarks. World Affairs Council Upstate wants to thank General John Allen for speaking today and thank everyone for joining us. I also would like to give a special thanks to the media sponsors today, Community Journal and Upstate Business Journal. We really appreciate it. Please join us again for next week's event on July 22nd at 12 p.m. when David Weiss and Carrie Hessler-Radley from Global Communities discuss the impact of COVID-19 on international development. For more information or to register for next week's event, please visit our website at upstateinternational.org. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Doctor. Good luck to you. Thank you for all you've done for us. Bye-bye.